I'm Kathleen Q with Nebraska Extension in Dodge County. I'm going to talk to you today a lot about insects. This is the time of the year when insects are out in full force. They've had time to hatch out and they're out and about and they're feeding. And so I'm going to talk a lot today about how that feeding affects the things that we're eating, whether it's your vegetable garden or the trees you're growing or the ornamentals that are in your yard. So there's a whole array of them here that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to start first with grasshoppers. Grasshoppers are kind of interesting things in that we tend to see them more where there's kind of wild areas close by. So if there's an area where it's not mowed or there's a field close by or something like that, we'll see more grasshoppers than we will in other places. And grasshoppers are interesting in that when they're small, the insecticides are very good at keeping their numbers down. But once they get up to 3/4 of an inch, then it's going to be a problem. These particular guys you see right here are less than 1/2 of an inch. And so our insecticides are going to be very good against them. And so a lot of times when I say that you see them primarily on wilder areas, so if you have an alley that's kind of wild or if there's a lot next to you that doesn't have much mowing done, you'll see higher populations of grasshoppers in those areas. And one of their favorite foods is something called pigweed. In particular, this one's called red root pigweed. You can tell because it has the red root. But see these holes in here? Most likely those were caused by grasshoppers. And a lot of times, if you have that wild area around a vegetable garden, you want to leave that material in place outside your vegetable garden because that way these guys will feed on that area instead of on your vegetable plants themselves. And one of the things that you can keep in mind is that if you got something like pigweed or some other kind of weed growing up in the vegetable garden itself, those you definitely want to remove because you don't want to make it easy for the grasshoppers to move from your weedy plants right into your vegetable patch and feed on your vegetable garden. And so keeping them at bay is really about keeping the garden itself clean and then the area outside of it, leaving it intact. So if you got some taller weeds, leave them. You know, what's going to happen there is they'll do their feeding on those plants rather than on your desirable plants. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, if you are going to take that extra step to do an insecticide, which you certainly can, there are insecticides on the market that are labeled for use on edible crops. And so technically, if you're spraying your vegetable garden itself, you do need an insecticide that's labeled for those kind of applications. And you also want to do a band outside the vegetable garden itself. A lot of times, if you can do at least 6 feet outside the vegetable garden and completely around the perimeter of it, that way, as they move towards your vegetable garden, they get caught up in that band of insecticide outside of it, and their numbers are brought down so that you see less damage in your vegetable garden. Now, let me mention that a lot of our insecticides that are labeled for use on edible crops have what we call a safe eating interval, and that's the length of time that must pass before you can safely eat that produce. Okay, so with that in mind, you don't want to spray and then harvest that crop sooner than that safe eating interval and store it in a refrigerator for that length of time. That doesn't count. It has to be outside on the plant and left for that length of time. So say for instance, you use a product that is 7 days is the safe eating interval. Then you're going, if there's some of that produce that needs to be harvested sooner than that 7 days, you're going to harvest things ahead of time, get those things picked, and then apply the insecticide, and then with the idea that you won't do any more harvest until 7 days later. So that's the big thing to keep in mind when you're using any kind of insecticide. Let me also mention one other thing. With any kind of damage on any plant, there is what we call the threshold of damage. So there are some things that can handle a certain amount of damage on the plants and they'll still produce for you. They'll still do absolutely fine. And so when it's that case, when the amount of damage is minimal, it really doesn't make sense to use any kind of an insecticide at all. It makes more sense to just maybe capture some of those, spray them down with soapy water, something simpler like that so that you minimize the damage. So that's the idea behind grasshoppers. Let's move on to another insect. This one is called a blister beetle. Notice that it's kind of a gray color to it. It's really interesting how it gets its name. It gets its name from the fact that this is one of my habits when I'm gardening and I run into an insect I don't want, I'll squish it. Well, this is one that you don't want to squish because if you do that, it can raise a blister on your skin. So its body fluids are volatile enough that they can cause some damage to your skin. So you definitely don't want to kill blister beetles as you run across them. And one thing that you'll notice about a lot of these insecticides that I talk about today is that the insects themselves have a broad range of things that they like to feed on, and the insecticides you use will depend a whole lot on what it is that they're doing the damage on. So obviously if it's something that's edible, you're going to use something that's labeled for edible crops. Okay? So with blister beetles, they like a range of things. I primarily find them on my beans and my peppers, but there are other things that they'll feed on. And so this is something that you have to be aware of. And one of the interesting things about blister beetles, so this one I actually caught yesterday, and I was careful not to squish it. I was holding it very carefully in my hand. But the thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to catch some of these insects, their instinct is to drop immediately to the ground. And that's a protective measure so that if they get lost in the mulch or the debris that's on the ground, that you won't find them. So sometimes when we're looking to capture some of these insects, when they drop to the ground is one way that you can actually use that instinct against them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about Japanese beetles. Okay, so that's the blister beetle and some of the damage that they do. Okay, so now we have some leaf beetles, and these guys are pretty small compared to some of the other beetles that I've talked about. And the leaf beetles typically have, these types have striations on the back. They're stripes on the back. And they can do a range of damage. And the leaf beetles don't have all that imaginative a name, but they also can feed on a wide variety of plants. There are some of the leaf beetles that are very specific. So for instance, the viburnum leaf beetle eats primarily viburnum leaves. And there's others that are like that. This particular beetle, which is gorgeous iridescent green and sort of looks like the Japanese beetle, is called the dogbane beetle. And so it feeds primarily on the leaves of dogbane. And so these things can do quite a bit of damage. And in fact, this was the damage that was being done to this geranium leaf. And I actually harvested this morning just to show what that was looking like. And these were all over the plant, so it was easy to attribute the damage to a specific insect because they were there and present on the plant. One thing you have to keep in mind too is that when you see damage like this and you don't find the actual culprit that's doing it, sometimes some of these leaf eaters are eating in the evening hours. So while you're in bed sleeping, these guys can be out there eating and you never see them during the daytime. And so sometimes if you're trying to catch someone in the actual act of eating on plants, go out there at night with your flashlight and just see what it is that you have going. And they could be actually feeding on the plants at night. You can capture them, identify them, and then pick the appropriate insecticide approach in order to get them. Okay. Let's move on to the Japanese beetle. This is the bane of everyone. They hate Japanese beetles. And part of the reason that Japanese beetles are such a problem is because there are over 300 species of plants that they'll feed on. I've seen peaches that are so covered in Japanese beetles that you literally can't see the peach. They're just covered, and they're all feeding, and they're all ruining that fruit and making it inedible for humans. So that's a big problem. And so a lot of times, some of these ornamentals that you're seeing some damage on may not be as big an issue as things that you want to eat yourself. So one of their favored foods are linden trees. And linden trees, a lot of times they're huge trees. And when they're huge trees, they can afford to lose some leaves to this guy. And that's not as big a deal as when it's a very small, newly planted tree. So the good rule of thumb is if it's a tree or a shrub that these guys really like, then the timing to get them is when those plants are actually pretty small. If it's a large, well-established tree, not as much of an issue. Now, I know that's easy for me to say when there's all this skeletonization that's going on. This is skeletonization. This happens to be a grape leaf. And skeletonization means that the tissue between the veins is eaten, and then the veins themselves are often left intact. And this is because the veins are chewier than the rest of the leaf, and so they don't want to eat those areas. They want the more tender portions of the leaf, and so that's why you see that skeletonization occurring between the veins. And I actually have quite a few grape leaves here. You can see there's all kinds of variation on how that manifests itself. But they're all very lacy looking. The key thing to keep in mind here is that the damage to the plant at this point is pretty minimal. So it's really hard to justify doing any kind of spray application. But again, they love to feed on the fruits of things as well. So I've seen grape clusters that are literally wall-to-wall Japanese beetles all over it. So in those instances, it's simpler than to simply keep the fruit clear of the beetles by putting something around them. And there's a lot of manufacturers of products that are basically fruit bags. And they're either cotton fabric or they're a nylon mesh. And they literally go over the grouping of fruit or over the individual peach. And there's a little drawstring or a twist tie that then holds those in place so that the Japanese beetles can't get in. And that's a simple way to keep the Japanese beetles away from fruit. And so sometimes it's easier to pick your battles and let some of this stuff just go by the wayside, because these plants are not going to be hurt in the long run. One of the things that you can do with Japanese beetles that's a fairly simple technique is gathering them. Now, on a linden tree, that may not sound easy, but on roses, it's a real simple thing to do. Remember what I said about some insects' instinct is to just simply drop to the ground when the plant is disturbed? That's one thing that you can use against the Japanese beetle in order to collect them. So you would start first by having some type of container that has soapy water in it. It's a real easy thing to do. A pitcher works. You can use a little basin. The ice cream pails work really well too. And what you would do is put it maybe a third to a half full of soapy water. And then what you would do is you would hold that under the branch of the plant, and say there's a Japanese beetle right here, you would tap it, and their instinct is to drop straight down into that soapy water. You can do that, and they'll drop right in there and drown. So you can actually get some revenge in on it too while you're at it. But that's a real simple way to get Japanese beetles all at one time. Now, is there a good time of day that works better than others for collecting Japanese beetles off plants? Because, all of our time is valuable. We don't want to go out there 5 times a day just to get the Japanese beetles off. And the answer to that is yes. There was a study that was done that looked at the time of day and which day resulted in overall the plant having less Japanese beetles on it. And the time of day of that is 7 o'clock in the evening. That's the most effective time to collect Japanese beetles. So what's at play there? What's happening that we're able to collect Japanese beetles at 7 o'clock in the evening and we have less Japanese beetles overall? Well, it's something called a pheromone. So we used to think that the Japanese beetles themselves gave off an odor that attracted other Japanese beetles to the site. That isn't what is happening. Instead, it's the plants themselves that are giving off the odors, in this case pheromones, that signal from one plant to another, hey, I'm under attack. Marshal your resources because you may be attacked as well. And there are defense chemicals that the plant makes within it that it sends out to helpfully ward off that particular insect. So when there's pheromones given off and the plant is telling another plant that's going on, the Japanese beetles can make note of that as well. And so if you're pulling the Japanese beetles off around 7 o'clock, that's from 7 o'clock in the evening all through the night hours that plant is not being fed on, it's not giving off pheromones, so you have less Japanese beetles overall. And that's been indicated time and again with the trials that they've done on the timing for picking up Japanese beetles. So really good thing, a real simple thing to do. Now, if you're looking at some other methods for getting Japanese beetles under control, then the big thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to spray any plant that is actively flowering, okay? The reason for that has to do a lot with these guys. So this is one of our native bees. It's a pollinator, and it's visiting a flower. Now, if we had an insecticide on this flower, then more than likely that Japanese beetle would die when it feeds on it, but also the pollinator would die too. And we want to keep our pollinators wherever possible because the pollinators are responsible for providing a lot of different foods for us. So roughly 1 bite out of 3 we have to thank because a pollinator pollinated that plant. So if you like watermelon, if you like cucumbers, if all those yummy things, it's because a pollinator is moving pollen from one plant to another. And so when we spray an insecticide on a flower, we're killing these guys, but we're also killing the good guys. So that's the main thing there. So a good rule of thumb is if you're using an insecticide, use it on the foliage of the plant, leaving the flower alone. And then the flower itself, you can actually collect the beetles by doing that trick I just mentioned where you tap it and they drop down into the soapy water. There's also a really nice publication that's been done by Jonathan Larson and Jody Green about management of Japanese beetles, and so this is a really effective way to get them under management when you're dealing with those kind of insects. So the idea here then is to not automatically reach for the products so that you can spray everything under the sun and get the different insects under management. The idea then is to look at the threshold levels, determine whether treatment actually needs to be done or not. If the treatment is opted for, then keeping those things away from the flowers is really critical. And sometimes it's nice to just keep the things that they do like, that you don't care about, like pigweed, there and in place so that they can continue to feed on it. So one other thing I want to mention is Japanese beetle traps. This is a trap that's funnel shaped that has a couple of fragrances in it that draw the Japanese beetle into the trap, down through the funnel, and into a catch basin below. And these things are too good at what they do. What happens is the Japanese beetle's flying along, it falls into the trap, goes down, and then suffocates among all the other Japanese beetles. But what happens if the Japanese beetle bumps into the trap and falls to the ground? It doesn't think that it's going to go back to the trap and try again. What it tends to do is go to nearby plants that it can feed on. And so the research is indicating to us that people that have Japanese beetle traps in their yard have a higher number of Japanese beetles overall than the yard that doesn't have a trap at all. So if you have a huge acreage, you could certainly purchase a Japanese beetle trap and put it on the far end of the acreage with the idea of drawing the Japanese beetles away from your yard. But if you have a regular city-sized lot, maybe the trap isn't the right thing for you. Thanks for watching today. This is Grow Big Red, and I'm Kathleen Q. You can check out our blogs on growbigred.com, or you can email me at kcue2@unl.edu. Thanks.